Hello, my name's Alan Foom, and today I'm going to talk about, is the oil and gas industry going through a Kodak moment? Now, I'm going to say, what is a Kodak moment? So, Kodak moment is a sudden, disruptive event which effectively wipes out an entire industry. And it's named after the Kodak company. So if you're old enough to remember film cameras, um, Kodak dominated the film market. Everyone used it. But after digital photography came along, film market declined precipitously, and Kodak were left floundering. They still exist as a firm, they still have quite a lot of patents, but they're definitely not the force they used to be. So, is the oil and gas industry about to have the same fate? Now, quite a few people would say, good, but I would say not so fast. So, let's have a look at how this might happen and what might be going on, whether it will happen at all. Now, this whole video is inspired by an article by Bill Fisher from a few years back. And Bill Fisher had a key point is that there are no Kodak moments, that's the title of his article, and it looks at this phenomenon. So his key points were, it's Kodak decades, not Kodak moment. Change comes actually quite slowly. Eventually, precipitately goes once it gets beyond the tipping point, but it's not as fast as people think. An incomplete substitution still hurts incumbents because your margins decline. Key internal stakeholder interests may conflict with the long-term future. Kodak had the film mafia. Past success in one industry is quite often an inhibitor of a future success. And substitution is an industry-wide phenomenon, so it's no good benchmarking one against another company in the same industry when they're all being affected in the same way, although they would cope with it in slightly different ways. The brand alone will not save you. Kodak had a great brand. And visionary leadership is needed for change to succeed. So how does the oil and gas industry measure up against it, which is what I'm going to look at. So in terms of decades, it's creeping disruption, which takes decades to work through. You get a new technology gets invented. Initially, it's not practical or economic. Then it evolves until it eventually becomes better than the previous technology and it takes over. So there's talk about energy transition. But any transition will take decades. It's not going to be instant. Fossil fuels at the moment account for 80+% of the world's energy system. For some things, oil cannot be substituted. It cannot be substituted for petrochemicals, many industrial processes, aviation. Very difficult to substitute it in shipping and heavy transport, although there are some initial prototypes, but they're at the very early stage. The 30-odd% of the energy in oil that is substitutable is electricity generation, where pretty much already is anyway, and light vehicles, which is at a very early stage, although obviously effective electric vehicles do exist. And some companies are preparing for a transition by investing in alternatives, focusing on resources relatively short-term payback, rather than long-term projects which may start paying back 15, 20 years. Different people however, do take a different view. Now, incomplete substitution still hurts profits, because what tends to happen is that initially when you have partial substitution, market share declines, and the incumbents have to deal with smaller margins. Now, the oil market is actually fairly finely balanced. You got 2% surplus, you get a price fall, crash, you get a 1% deficit, you get a price spike, which is currently what's going on right now in October 2021. And so you get very rapid signals. Although oil companies do have long time horizons, years or decades, but we do monitor the situation very closely. So if things are going in a different direction, we will change investment patterns. Surprise is still, of course, possible. If you're looking at what oil demand might do in the future, so this is a set of forecasts for 2040. The yellow is the demand in 2019 before COVID. Orange is demand in 2020. And these are a whole variety of forecasts, BP, Shell, International Energy Agency, the Energy Information Agency in America, Administration in America, etc. And they all have a variety of figures. So if 2019 was 100, you got anything going from just under 120 to about 50, which is the BP's net zero scenario, which they themselves see as highly unlikely. You're talking about rapid transitions, you're talking about 66 to 70 versus 100 today. That's over the next 20 years. One thing to bear in mind with a lot of these forecasts, though, is that the Europeans tend to be a lot more bearish in oil than Americans and Asians. And when you look at what's going on in terms of a graph, so that's the years, that's the oil demand, so that's history, that's the 2024, and that's what might happen next. You can see a wide variety of spreads. Most of the growth is going to happen will be in the non-OECD countries, in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. The OECD oil demand has been declining, particularly in Europe, since about 2008. It's declined a little bit in America, it's kind of flatlined it, but that's influences a little bit of where people come from. But the key point here is that the world will use as much in the next 20 years as they did in the last 20. What happens beyond that's a little bit harder to forecast. But if you're in the oil industry, you have long-term horizons. So interests of key stakeholders may conflict with long-term. Now, the old technology model worked well. And the firms might neglect new technologies, focus on squeezing profits from old businesses that they know and love and understand, giving up an uncertain future for a successful past, in Bill Fisher's quote. So how does that really happen? Well, management views within the oil industry used to be focused on the idea of ever-rising demand, need to find new resources to meet this. Most forecasts actually have demand still rising for a considerable length of time, but the more visionary executives can see a concept of peak demand, but that's predicted decade, 2 decades, even further into the future. Of course, we could all be wrong, but that's where it is. And there's a thought of, are you cannibalizing investment in oil and gas versus investment in alternative energy projects? There's only a limited amount of capital that a Western company has for investment. But again, each project has to stand on its own merits. If an oil project makes sense, you do that. If an alternative energy project makes sense, you do that instead. Depends on return, depends what you can make money out of. There is, however, a feeling, and I think this is at the core root of it, is what competencies and capabilities does a hydrocarbon company have in an alternative energy future? How can we contribute to it if we could? Now, oil and gas management and engineers have a specific set of skills which might not be appropriate to the new energy business. So that's where I feel the challenge really is, and quite how you move to that. And that's what a lot of people within the oil and gas industry are struggling with. Now, past success has often inhibited future success. You know, if you've done things successfully as incumbent, previous generation, very difficult to change. And fear of cannibalizing existing cash flow. It's different from investment, cash flow. Lead to denial and hesitancy when first the signs of disruption appear. I'm not sure if there's enough. There's certainly hesitancy. I'm not sure if there's enough denial. People do see a different point of view. So when unthinkable happens, suddenly companies are vulnerable to disruptions and they don't think. Well, yeah, the oil and gas model has been successful in the last century. A lot of these companies, I'll come to the slide at the end of the presentation, have been there for a very long time and been very successful. Now, what can people do in the future when the world might change? You can focus on your past model, the bits that you're good at, better capital discipline, stop wasting money on projects that aren't that great, squeeze your margins, innovate for the future, do things smarter. Yeah, well, you can do that. You can also, at the same time, look at alternative energy, which compete for resources from other ventures. Now, the companies with the biggest alternative energy divisions tend to be European majors, your Shells, your BPs, your Total, who've changed its name to Total Energies, to some extent Equinor, it used to be Statoil. They have a lot of consumer-facing businesses. They have a lot of businesses in Europe where the climate belief is strongest relative to other areas where people are more concerned about basically, frankly, fueling their future and having a life of any sort, Africa, Asia, Latin America. So they tend to be more focused on it than, let's say, the American majors, which tend to be more focused on where they're at, and the NOCs would just want to stick to their knitting. Different companies, different philosophies, different markets, different societies. And oil and gas companies have tried diversifying in the past. There's quite a lot of that in the 70s and 80s, and frankly, they were lousy at it. Here's a picture of an Exxon word processor. Why the hell would you want to buy a word processor from Exxon? So people in the oil business went into computing, software, coal, metals, mining, nuclear power, electricity generation. None of it worked for them. Didn't understand the businesses, didn't have the right skills, and maybe a little bit too arrogant, to be honest. But the corporate memory from that is still bruised, particularly with the likes of Exxon's and the American companies. So there's a bit of a fear of going into new things. But let's just have a little look at how companies are organized and where they are. So you got your upstream, so that's a picture of an oil rig. You got the midstream. So the traditional outlines here in blue, the new energies in green. Your tankers, your LNGs, your pipelines are moving the product to refining, then marketing. With the green side, you've got the upstream, wind, geothermal, solar, which generates electricity, moving it along cables and networks, moving it to customers. Now, the customer side of it, the marketing, a lot of the integrated oil companies do. Refining, I think there's actually quite a lot of upside in that, although a few companies like BP have got out of that business. Maybe they made a mistake, I don't know. And upstream, you can still have what we call advantage hydrocarbons, relatively low carbon impacts, trying to get the costs down to keep that going. And maybe there could be some synergies. For example, in Norway, there have been instances of using wind-powered electricity to power some of the electricity within a production platform and try to integrate operations. So maybe there might be some scope there. But again, it depends on the company, depends on the culture, depends on where they're going. Now, goes without saying, but a substitution is typically an entire industry phenomenon. So disruptive forces hit everybody all at once. And this is kind of what's going along in terms of the views of the financial world, where the oil and gas sector is out of favor with Western stock markets. Disruption hasn't fully happened yet. When, how will it come? We don't know to what extent. And there's a need to gain investor confidence. And how do you do that? You operate effectively, you have the margins, you have everything else, but it doesn't seem to hit the mark with investors. And then you have the alternative energy division. The stock market performances, for example, of Exxon, who have relatively limited new energies investment, and BP, who've gone all in on new energy, actually fairly similar. So is it working? And the brand is not enough. Kodak had a great brand. And brands may matter less than all executives think because petroleum is a commodity. They don't really care about which gas station you fill up at. Different countries have a thing about brands. For Asia, for instance, has these multi-brand conglomerates, which works effectively. And will an oil company brand work in a new area? You can always obviously create a new brand, but that takes some doing. And then visionary leadership. Now, Bill Fisher said that you need inspirational visionary leadership in shielded change. And most companies' leadership is neither. Now, oil industry has had a lot of inspirational leaders, and I did a video on the family tree of the oil companies, which talks about some of these people. The people who created and shaped large companies, people who built up companies that already exist into even bigger ones and turned companies around. I worked for a person called Frank Chapman, who turned the company I was working around into something quite significant. And working with people like that, it can be quite inspirational. And radical change is challenging. Euro majors are certainly talking the talk. They're putting money into these sort of things. Will they work? We don't know. It's too early to tell. So, some opinions. A Kodak moment for the oil industry? Not so fast. Demand will continue for a long time. Some oil users will be substituted, and those they should be. Something better comes along, but others cannot be. So will demand for non-substitutable uses make up for the substituted? So for example, growth in petrochemicals, growth in industrial processes, growth in shipping, heavy trucking, aviation compensate for decline in light vehicles. Quite possible, as the rest of the world gets richer, which is what I think might actually happen. All companies are investing in alternatives and new energies, but these are lower margin businesses. They have their own risks, technical risks, commercial risks, policy risks. If an alternative energy investment is dependent on government policy, government subsidies, regulation, etc., that's a risk because governments may change. And oil majors have had a poor record in diversification in the past. Will it be better this time? Well, I hope so. There's some leaders like Bernard Looney at BP think that they might. But the key thing to bear in mind is you've got companies that have been around for 100 years. They've survived, they've evolved, they've innovated, and they'll continue to do so. So to finish off, family tree of the oil majors. Something I've got a video on, how these people have evolved, how these people have grown. Thank you very much for your time. My name's Alan Foom. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.